I'm Tara Spiegel. I am the Education Manager at Keohole Center for Sustainability, which is located right in Nelha. So my job is to work on sustainable energy and a lot of other things. Obviously, right now we're in a COVID-19 pandemic, so things have changed a little bit, and we've reinvented the way that we do education programs, and you're participating in that now. So we are going to have some fun today. I want to introduce her very quick and let her tell you a little bit more about herself, but this is Jen from Waikaloa Dry Forest Initiative, and she's going to be joining us today for our program that we call Community Connection, where every week we're going to host somebody from the community, ask them a little bit about what they do, more importantly, the challenges they're facing with COVID-19, and how they're adapting, overcoming, and innovating around that. And then we'll be doing an activity every week. And this week, I gotta say, I'm really excited for the one that Jen is gonna do with us. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to her so she can introduce herself and a little bit about what she does.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Lawson. I am the Executive Director of the Waikaloa Dry Forest Initiative. So we're a very small nonprofit. There's only 4 of us that work for WDFI. And we are charged with the management and restoration of the Waikaloa Dry Forest Preserve in Waikaloa Village. So that's here on the Big Island in South Kohala. And we are trying to restore the native dryland forest ecosystem. And part of the way that we do that is through educational programs, which we'll talk a little bit more about today probably. But yeah, my background is in botany. I'm a plant person. And I got interested in conservation through botany. So as someone interested in that kind of work, I started working in Waikaloa in 2012, I think, and have been with the organization ever since. So as an executive director, my job looks a little different every day. I'm developing programs and plans for restoration and also for education. I do a lot of fundraising and grant writing, reporting, and then actual out in the field education a lot of the time, which has been a little bit different since this whole situation has come upon us.
So since you're sharing a little bit about that, I think we should jump into that question. What have been some of the challenges for you and Waikaloa Dry Forest Initiative because of COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing some short-term things happen, and we're also looking forward to some long-term challenges. But in the short term, an organization like us, we really run on volunteers. So not being able to gather, school being out, means that we have a lot fewer people in the forest helping us do our work, but also participating in our programs. So just this abrupt change in how we share the forest with people has been challenging, but we've been able to adapt to that in some ways. We of course can't have volunteers in the forest helping us plant trees and collect native seeds and do the work that we need to do, but we can still bring the forest to our community through avenues like Zoom and other channels. So we've been able to adapt some of our programs in that way. But yeah, that void of volunteers in the forest and actually doing that on the ground restoration work has been really interesting for us, because since we were formed, we've really been building that. When we first started, it was just a few of us out there in the forest, and that's changed a lot and turned into a really big support group that helps us on our day-to-day out in the field. So not having those people around has been a struggle in some ways for us to get our work done. But luckily we were at the end of our planting season as we come into summer when all of this happened. So we were actually able to finish up that work and kind of move into our summer activities. But right after spring break is when we stopped having classes, we stopped being able to gather. And so our school programs, like our after school program, the Future Foresters, has been all online since spring break. So that's been an interesting challenge and a personal one for me, because I took over teaching that course from our normal kumu, who is on maternity leave right now. So I met all these kids on Zoom for the most part and have been teaching place-based outdoor nature studies online. But we have such a great group of kids. They've been awesome and participating and enjoying it. And that's been a real interesting challenge and kind of a fun way to figure out how we can continue to do these lessons without actually being in place, because we're so used to having the trees and the plants as our background out there.
Thanks for sharing that. I guess I kind of want to add another question to that. It sounds like you've innovated and had them doing this online learning, this distance learning. Have they been able to see new places and kind of do field trips like they would normally do?
Yeah, so field trips are a really important component of our after school program because we meet these kids in the Waikaloa Dry Forest Reserve every week, and they know the place very well, and it's the context for all of our learning. But it's also important that we get kids out into the community to see what work everybody else is doing. There's a lot of us that are working on conservation of natural resources issues and sustainability issues. So at the end of the year, we usually plan a lot of in-person field trips to get these kids into other places. But now that we are all connected online rather than in person, all of these different places that we'd like to go and learn about are actually equidistant, right? So we're not just confined to where we can drive to in an afternoon. We can actually go just about anywhere to learn. So we've been having a good time doing that. So we were able to visit with you, Tara, at KCS and learn about sustainable building and some really amazing stuff going on at the center. And we were also able to do some field trips on Oahu where we were learning about ahupua'a and estuary management and gardening and just different climates and different vegetation and different projects that people are coming together to work on for the betterment of our communities and our environment. So that's been really fun. And then we're also taking the kids and adults and all of our followers out into the Dry Forest Preserve as much as we can through live tours and question and answer periods, and we've been doing some webinars and just trying to figure out what things people want and need. And it's been really impressive to see how many people from all over are interested in learning about plants while they have this extra time on their hands being stuck at home.
I can say I've joined into a couple of your tours of the dry forest and the nursery while we've been on quarantine, and they're awesome. So if any of you have not gone onto those lives that they've done, that Jen and Rob have done, I highly recommend them. They're very engaging and entertaining, and I learned a lot. So thank you for doing those. I know that that's a little outside of the common realm for you all being digitally touring, but it was absolutely awesome to see. And something that I always end up missing because I'm working certain days. So it was nice to finally get to join you on a tour of
Yeah,
the
I
forest.
think it's actually been really good for our morale too. It's a little bit easy to get disappointed that we don't have all of our friends out there like we normally do, and managing a 275-acre preserve all by yourself, like our preserve manager Rob does, can be challenging any day. But when you don't have that influx of people coming out to learn and participate, it can be a little bit of a downer. So I think it's been really fun for him to share his excitement with people. And also he could get into places that normally we would never take you, just like you took us under the building there at Keohole Center for Sustainability. Rob is able to get underneath these trees and really look closer at things where, a normal group of tour or on a tour wouldn't really want or need to go.
I normally this segment we would ask what are some of the innovations and positive outcomes that have come from COVID-19 for you all, but I think you've already just jumped right in there. I think that opportunity to connect even more people, see things we normally wouldn't be able to see. Anything else you want to highlight as far as the forest or for you as an organization that have just been something wonderful that's come out of COVID-19 or innovation for you all that's come out of COVID-19?
I think it's just been really fun to see how our team reacted to all of this. And, right out of the gate, we were ready to just change our programming and do something different. And because we're a really small, lean nonprofit, we were able to just be creative in how we continue to deliver our programs. And so that's been really fun for us to do. As time goes on, it becomes a little bit more challenging to keep up the pace and to continue to have time to do these additional things. But it's been really great to see the response. And, we can normally reach anywhere from 25 to 30 people on a First Friday Huaka'i. And on our virtual tours, we're reaching hundreds of people from all over. And, that's been really cool to see that we can seize this moment where people have this time to be engaged with community efforts around the world, really. And it's been really, really encouraging to see that people are interested in learning from us. Yeah, so that it's been challenging, but definitely some positives have come out of it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else you want to share about Waikaloa Dry Forest, about the native plants, before we kind of maybe jump into our activity in a little bit here?
Sure, I'll just give a little background about what we're doing and kind of how we do our work. So we talked a lot about our educational programs because those are the things that we're adapting to the situation right now. But our primary focus is forest conservation. So what we have up in Waikaloa is a preserve that is protecting some of the last remaining dry forest that's in the region. So unfortunately, it's a very rare, critically endangered actually ecosystem that we don't really see much of anymore. Where we see from Kohala to Kona, where we see all this grassland today, used to be shrubland and closed canopy forest. And if you've ever driven the coast road or the top road, you know that that's certainly not the case today. So unfortunately, we've lost a lot of it, but there are these few pockets of dry forest left with ancient trees that sort of point to the history of the place and guide us in this forest restoration that we're trying to do. So we control a lot of threats, goats and invasive species and insects, and especially wildfire up in Waikaloa. We're always doing our best to prevent that from happening in our area. But the really fun part of our work is, once we clear the space for these things and protect them from the threats, we can actually plant native species and broadcast native seeds, and we start to see the regeneration of this forest that hasn't been in Waikaloa intact in over 100 years. So that's where volunteers really come into play. We collect all of our own seeds from plants in the area or from partner sites around the island, and then we grow these native plants in our nursery. And once they're big enough, we invite the community in to help us plant them out. And since 2011, we've done about 50 acres of planting in this fashion. So for a small team like us, that's a lot, 50 acres on, and it's not beautiful, nice farmland with rich soil that's easy to dig in. This is tough rock or lava flow with, big boulders and lots of rocks. And it's hot and dry and exposed, and it's a challenging site to restore for sure. But we've been really successful in reestablishing native plants on, like I said, about 50 acres through planting, and then an additional 25 or so acres through native seeding. So in a pretty short time, in one of the most challenging places to do this kind of work in Hawaii, we've seen the transformation of grassland back into native shrubland and short and growing, but forest. So that's the main focus of our work, is to rebuild that community of plants, and hopefully in doing that, we bring back lots of the microbes and insects and even birds one day that belong in this native ecosystem. So to do this kind of work, we need to know a lot about plants. So we need to know about their ecology, who lives in this dry environment. I just talked about how challenging the terrain is and how dry it can be out there, and windy and hot. So we need to really understand the plants that are native to our region and how they can survive in this area, which ones we should reintroduce, which plants really don't belong there at all. So we need to know about their ecology. And we need to know more than just, which species of plants belong there. We need to know what kind of requirements they need, rainfall and nutrients, but also, the microbes in the soil and the pollinators that they require to be able to make seed and survive on their own. So we can start to understand this plant reproductive ecology, which is really complicated to understand pollinator relationships, especially when you're trying to restore something that's now a grassland that you want to be a forest. So when you're thinking about doing this restoration, it's really important to think about the reproductive ecology of your plants so that they can eventually make their own seeds and regrow the forest by themselves without our input. So one of the ways to start really understanding that is to look closely at flowers. So that's what I wanted to do with the group today, was a little introduction to plant floral morphology or plant anatomy. And we can look at flowers to do that and get a little bit more understanding of how flowers work.
This is the part I'm most excited for, I'm not gonna lie. So for those of you who are watching from home, this is the time, if you don't have a flower, and maybe Jen, you can hold up a couple of the flowers you have just to give people an idea. If you don't have a flower, go out in your yard, pick a flower real quick. We are going to do a flower dissection. For those of you who already have one and are prepared, brownie points for you. I'm gonna go get another flower from my yard, but what I'm gonna do while some of us go get a flower for the next 30 seconds to a minute, I'm gonna go ahead and share our whiteboard here. Anybody on Zoom, I have a challenge for you. I wanna see how beautiful of a willy willy you can draw while the rest of us go get our flowers. So game on for everybody else. And if you don't have a flower, go get one, and we'll be back in 30 seconds to dissect our flower. Oh yeah, that's looking great. All right, we'll give everybody just another second. I'm gonna save this beautiful drawing. All right, Jen, I'm gonna turn it back over to you. I have, so everybody at home knows what we each have. I have a passion fruit flower that's kind of closed up right now, and a big red African tulip.
Cool. Yeah, I don't have any native plants today. I'm up in my office in Waimea, so I just collected some things from around the parking lot, actually. There are flowers everywhere. But yeah, so we'll go through and hopefully we can at least use yours, Tara. We can see how all of these flowers that we have are similar or different. So flowers are the reproductive structure of plants, or of most plants, flowering plants. And when we think of flowers, we think of things that are really showy like this often. And you know, the main point of any flower, whether it's really big like this or maybe smaller and reduced like this, the whole point of a flower is to be able to make seeds. So that way they can sustain themselves and their population can increase. So some plants, like if you think of a grass, for example, they don't have really showy flowers, and they don't necessarily need them because grasses get pollinated by the wind. So the wind doesn't need a big showy flower to be attracted to a grass. It just blows, and the pollen on a grass flower blows away in the wind, lands on another grass, and the pollination occurs that way. But some flowers and some plants do need a pollinator. And so what they do is they invest in this big showy flower to try to get a pollinator to come and visit them and pollinate them so that eventually they can make fruit, which contains their seeds. So we're going to look at some showy flowers and hopefully we can dissect them together. You don't need any equipment, just your fingers and your eyeballs. But to start, yeah, some flowers are radially symmetric, like this one. So every side looks the same on this flower. So we say that's radially symmetric, like a circle or like a star. Sometimes you might notice it. And then some flowers are not symmetric. They are a little bit asymmetrical, and they definitely have differences as you rotate them around. So you can look at your flower and decide if it's radially symmetric or if it's asymmetric. And the main point of being one or the other is to try to get your pollinator to visit. So one may be more attractive than another. Some flowers have separate petals. Again, like this one, we're all pretty familiar with petals. So we know that that's this kind of showy part here, and they're all separated. That's how we think of flowers a lot of times. And then other times, like this one again, they're fused together. So this one has separation at the very top, but when you look down the petals, they're actually all connected. So that doesn't mean that there's only one petal. There's actually, in this case, 4 or 5, but they are actually connected and fused. And then some flowers are perfect, and perfect means that they have both male and female components to them, while other flowers only have female or male. And unfortunately, we call those flowers imperfect. But that is just pointing to whether or not there are male and female or separate on each of your flowers. So all of the flowers that I have today are perfect. They have male and female parts, and probably the flowers that you have do too. So we can look at these different flowers, even though they look really different and they're probably attracting different pollinators, they all have basically the same structures. So I'm going to start with this hibiscus because pretty much everybody, at least in Hawaii, is familiar with this genus of plants. We have many native hibiscus, and then we have lots of introduced ones that are pretty much everywhere you go in Hawaii. But they are really specialized flowers in some ways. So the way that I like to dissect flowers is to turn them upside down and start at the bottom. And we can look at all of the different whorls of structures. So in a flower, everything is arranged in a whorl. And if you think of it that way, it's really easy to separate all of the different things. So on a hibiscus, this first whorl of stuff that I have here are leaves, and they're called bracts. And so I'm just going to get rid of those because those are not flower parts. Those are just leaves. I mean, not that leaves aren't important. But if you look at the bottom of your flower, a lot of times this first whorl which is called the sepals, or the calyx. Calyx, it kind of looks like a crown. Oftentimes the sepals are green. So in the case of the hibiscus, they're green. Sometimes they might actually look like petals. Sometimes it might be really hard to tell the difference between sepals and petals because sometimes they are interchangeable. But whatever ones are on the outside world, no matter what they look like, that outside world is going to be the sepals. So my sepals are fused together at the bottom, and then they come apart at the top. And I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sepals that are then fused together. So that first whorl, the calyx, is made up of sepals. And you can remove that. And when you do that, you might find that there's a whole bunch of nectar in there. For me, there's a whole lot of nectar in this hibiscus because this hibiscus is trying to attract something that is hungry. And on this plant that I have, if you live in West Hawaii, you know these are jacarandas. They're going off right now. You can see how tiny my sepals actually are. They're so small that it might actually be hard for me to take them off. I'm not sure. You can see them. So I'm going to leave them on. But the next whorl.
Is this technically a sepal, or is this part of the leaf for?
I think that is the calyx. Yeah.
Ah.
So once you remove the calyx, you're left with the next whorl, which are the petals, which most of us are familiar with petals. It's not a super scientific term, but it's the one that we use in botany to describe these showy structures called petals. So my calyx was all fused at the bottom, but my petals are actually all separate. So this whorl, the petals, is called a corolla, like a Toyota Corolla. And if you take those off,
is this where we have to say, he loves me so, he loves me not?
Yeah, I think that's the traditional whirl to So once you remove your petals, you're kind of left with this, maybe yours doesn't look quite like mine. Tara's has a lot of different structures. Mine is very compact. Hers is very
floofy?
Yeah. Floofy.
Is that a technical term?
Yeah, let's go with that. And mine is really compact because hibiscus have this really specialized way of organizing their male parts on the flower. But basically what you have left in your hand are the reproductive parts. So the sepals and the petals are just extra. They're there to, the sepals usually protect the flower as it's emerging. And then the petals are usually the most showy part of the plant that are going to attract birds or bees or butterflies or whoever wants to eat the nectar or pollen. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Jen?
Sure.
So you're saying that these different components attract different pollinators. Is there a rhyme or reason to the pollinators they attract? Like, would my very floofy flower attract a different pollinator than your very simple reproductive organ on your hibiscus?
Yeah, definitely. So plants and their pollinators usually evolve together. Sometimes we have things like sunflowers or, some plants are we call them generalists, where they can host a variety of different pollinators, and those pollinators can do a pretty good job. And then we have other plants like this hibiscus or even this jacaranda that not every animal could get in there. Not every pollinator could get in there. So depending on how much pollen or the color or the smell or the amount of nectar or whether or not there's a landing pad on your flower for an insect or a bird, you can start to kind of figure out which pollinators might be most attracted to your flower. So in the case of red flowers that don't smell, that only have a little bit of pollen, that's really kind of difficult to get into, you're probably looking at a bird pollinator, a bird whose beak will fit into the tube to get that nectar, and then its little head will hit this pollen and do the pollinating. Yeah, so it definitely is designed for pollinators. So when we're looking at my hibiscus, this is the female parts on the inside, and the next whorl would be the male parts. So I'm going to set this aside for a minute so that we can look at one that's a little bit more straightforward, because the hibiscus are really cool and their male parts are doing something interesting.
So if we were properly pulling petals, it would be "we love me, so we love me not."
Yes.
Because that's the perfect plant world.
These fused petals are harder to get off because they're like one big sheet. But if you look closely on this one, you can see that there are wrinkles in it. And actually, if you looked at this jacaranda under UV light, you would see this like perfect landing strip. You would see different color contrasts that insects can see that we can't see. And they're basically telling the pollinator, right here is the nectar, come here, get the nectar. And then the insect comes in, feeds, and then by doing that gets pollen on their bodies and then moves it around to other plants.
So they basically have an airport runway for their pollinators.
It literally looks like that under UV, yes. And some plants can even turn that off when they're not ready to be pollinated. And then they those pigments are really expressed when they are ready for pollination. And then once they're pollinated, it starts to fade so that insects, particularly bees, don't waste their time. Yeah.
So flowers aren't that different from a lot of animals that have like different feathers or different colors to their skin when it's time to try to make more animals.
Yeah, definitely. These petals are like peacock feathers. They're indicating that this plant is ready for reproduction. And because this plant is trying to attract something other than another flower or other than, you know, another peacock, it has to design itself so that those pollinators are attracted. Yeah, so
I really love how inclusive flowers are. They're wees. There's no male or female typically, or in a perfect flower, there's no male or female. It's both, and they are all about just spreading the love to all species instead of just one, another flower.
And that coevolution and that codependency is really important when you're thinking about forest restoration and conservation in general. We can't just protect this, you know, coquille, for example. We have to make sure that the pollinators are there too. Otherwise, this coquille makes all of this beautiful pollen and nectar, and nobody's there to receive it, and that means it can't make seeds. So it is important to be inclusive in your planning, for sure.
We should be more inclusive, like plants. Candy had a quick question.
Oh, sure.
Actually, referring to that, if they are the perfect flower, why don't they just pollinate themselves? Why do they need a pollinator?
Yeah, so some plants do pollinate themselves and some can pollinate themselves, but they would rather not in a lot of cases, and that has to do with inbreeding. So just like in animals, it's not the best strategy to be really inbred over generations. It's better to have that genetic diversity from the whole population. So that's where pollinators become really important, right? Because they're moving not just pollen from one flower to another on the same tree, but from other trees. So they're moving that genetic material around through the pollen. Yeah. So on this one, my jacaranda, you can see the next whorl are these little spindly guys. And they're outside of this one kind of fuzzy structure. And these are the anthers. So these anthers are the male parts of the flower, and they carry the pollen. So on the stamen, we have at the very top the anther, and then the spindly part is a filament, and that whole structure is called a stamen. So a lot of times, kind of just an interesting fact, a lot of times the number of stamens inside of a flower is the same or twice as many as the petals. So it's not a random number. Sometimes there's a lot, like I would imagine you have a lot there on that passion fruit flower. And I have quite a few on my hibiscus. And sometimes you only have a few, like on this one. So plants that only make a few anthers with that pollen available probably have a more specialized pollinator who's really good at getting that pollen on them and moving it around. Where plants that make lots and lots of pollen with lots and lots of anthers, they're ready for any beetle, bee, wasp, fly to crawl around on them and hopefully get the pollen stuck to them, and then they move on to the next one to feed. So you can start to tell who pollinates based on how many anthers there are. So on the hibiscus, back to this one, it's really hard to dissect this one to pull it all apart one by one, but actually this whole structure is filaments of the stamen that have fused together around the female part of the plant. So it's protecting the ovaries, which would be sitting right at the bottom of this. So just like animals, plants have ovaries in the female parts, and that's where the seeds will eventually develop. So this staminal column is all fused together around the female parts of the plant, and that protects it. And then on my jacaranda, if I pull away the androecium or those, oops, dropped it. Those stamens, I have left this one, which is immature, doesn't have this floofy part like this one does. And this is the female part. So the females are, this part is sometimes called a pistil or a carpel. It can be many carpels fused together, but for this purpose, we'll call it the pistil. And this whole structure is what receives pollen. So the female part receives the pollen, hopefully from another plant, and hopefully some good pollen that's deposited on it. And in the case of jacaranda, it has these special feathery-like structures at the top. This is called the stigma, and that is sticky, and pollen sticks to it. And when the pollen sticks to it, it can sit there for an amount of time, but then it gets to work. The pollen sends its sperm cell all the way down this super long tube to get to those ovules where it can actually fertilize the eggs and then eventually makes those swell up into seeds. So on the hibiscus, we have a really cool stigma. It looks like this. There's only 5 points of contact for that pollen to land. And if all of those receive pollen, then the pollen can go all the way down that super, super, super long tube. That's a long way for one cell to have to travel to fertilize the egg. And then once that fertilization happens, we have the development of the embryo and the seed. And then.
So are all 3 of these points on the lilycoid, the female?
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah, so sometimes these 5 points represent 5 different stigma, 5 different styles that happen to be fused together, and then 5 different carpels at the bottom that have the eggs inside. So sometimes those are all separate and you'll have a bunch of different structures and they'll come together to make a fruit. And sometimes they're all fused together and they start out as one and they end up as one little capsule or package or fruit for all of those seeds.
So when a pollinator goes in, they're trying to extract the pollen from the male component, and then they, by chance, also whatever pollen they already have goes to the female component. Is that how that works?
Yeah. So if you can, I'll try to put my flower back together here, or we can just imagine. There we go. So if you are going into this hibiscus flower, I should have got 2 so I could put it back together. Your bird, and you want to get, and actually a lot of hibiscus are pollinated by hummingbirds, but we don't have those here in Hawaii. So our hibiscus has had to adapt to a different suite of pollinators. They're still bird pollinated, but kind of an interesting thing. So if you're a bird and you have a beak and you want to eat a lot of nectar, you're going to go deep inside this plant and you're going to rub that pollen on your head. And then when you go into the next hibiscus, the first thing that your head is going to rub against is the stigmas of those plants. So it's all designed to move that pollen around as effectively, if not efficiently. So if you're a grass, you just use the wind. But if you are a really specialized plant like a hibiscus or orchids are kind of renowned for being very, very specialized, then you need one particular type of pollinator that has just the right shape to come in and get just the right amount of pollen stuck to it and be reliable enough to move to another plant to be pollinated.
Okay, so you intrigued me. What pollinates orchids then?
So I think almost every orchid has a specific pollinator. So they have one insect friend that does all of the work. And some of the most famous instances of this pollinator flower coevolution can be seen in orchids that actually mimic the mate of their wasp pollinator. So they actually appear to be that female wasp or insect, so that the males will come and spend plenty of time on them and make sure that they get pollinated. So yeah, it's really interesting. They're all a little bit different. Some groups or families of plants have similar traits, so that they all are bird pollinated, or most of them are bird pollinated or butterfly or pollinated by beetles. But yeah, we have a lot of diversity in the dry forest as far as which pollinators are being attracted. And you know, some of those plant species that are really specialized maybe become more endangered as their pollinators are lost, where plants that are more generalist, that can be pollinated by lots of different species, or even new you know, non-native species, are able to do better.
So do you see that with COVID-19, do you see, since there's less pollution going on, less activity outside, do you see maybe the pollinators coming back more or having a little relief? Is that something that's happening with COVID-19 or not?
I'm sure it is happening, especially in places that are, you know, really busy or where the air quality is really poor. In the dry forest, I can't imagine it's having a huge impact. Some of our pollinator issues actually go beyond people right now, and are due to long stretches with disease or habitat loss. But I could see for sure in places where you know, maybe the air quality is better right now, other insects that aren't usually there are able to come back, or flowers are able to do better. Certainly possibility. And then I think, go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just going to answer Candy's question. We definitely have species in the dry forest that are missing their pollinators, and that's a lot of that has to do with how many birds used to be present in our lowland dry forest and how few there are left now. So our Hawaiian honeycreepers have evolved to pollinate specific groups of plants, and with their absence, it's hard for those plants to become pollinated. And since the introduction of avian malaria, we've seen a huge reduction in the number of birds that are in the lowlands, particularly because we have mosquitoes there and we have malaria there. So a lot of the plants in those lower elevations no longer have their bird pollinators. In some cases, like with the willy willy, there are other insects and maybe some birds that can actually do that pollinating. Like we see big carpenter bees visiting the willy willy flowers and moving the pollen around, and we still have seed production of those things. I think it's a bigger problem in the wet forest, where we have some species that just can't be pollinated by anything else. And in those cases, hand pollination is a really good tool that restoration biologists have to perpetuate those species. Of course, it's not a sustainable method of conservation. We want to bring back those pollinators as much as we can.
Well, I think you answered all the questions. We don't have any other questions on Facebook Live. So is there any last things you want to share with us? Any last, you know, pieces of empowerment that you've seen from COVID-19 for your work, or any message you want to leave our viewers with today that's extra special concerning our current situation?
Sure. You know, I'm really impressed at the way that our community, not just in conservation, but in general, but certainly in this line of work, you know, sustainability, conservation, I'm really impressed how people have come together to kind of, you know, partner up in new ways to pool our resources, share them with the world. But I'm also really impressed how that audience has just, you know, has just sprung up. we have this new group of people that are interested in this kind of work. And I hope that once this is over and we're able to get back to our normal lives as much as that's possible, we continue to engage these partnerships and work together and share and try to problem solve and volunteer with these organizations that have been, helping us all get through this kind of crazy time.
And so to that, when we can do work again, when we can be out in the public, how do people get connected and volunteer with you guys?
Yeah, so we have a website, waikaloadryforest.org, and our public volunteer opportunities are all listed there. You can actually sign up right through our website. It has everything you need to know about volunteering with us. Those are usually held on the second and I think I'm getting this right. Man, it's been a while. Second and fourth Saturdays of the month. So those are our public days. We also do a lot of field trips for students and different types of groups that want to come, as a business or as a class, to come and learn from us. And those opportunities are also on our website. It's a great place to learn a little bit more about what you might be getting into if you come out to volunteer. But one of the other things that has been a real bummer for us and has hit us pretty hard financially is that we are supported by a thrift shop, and our thrift shop is all run by volunteers who can't volunteer right now. We're looking forward to opening up. But there are other ways to support us too, by shopping or by volunteering at our thrift shop when it opens back up. So yeah, there's lots of ways that you can help, even if you can't dig holes on this treacherous lava that I keep describing. There's lots of ways that you can get involved with WDFI.
And you throw one of the best community events of the year every year, the Willy Willy Festival. So also a fun time to volunteer, and you have a lot of different activities around that. So definitely, if you're watching and you haven't been involved or haven't gone, get involved. They're a great group to be involved in. If you're into clean energy, you can get involved with us. Like Jen was saying, it's hard for a lot of nonprofits right now, not making money, but the best way to support us really is being present and giving us your time. So please, when this is over and you need to be outside, get a hold of one of these groups. Even if you're not interested in what we do here, Waikaloa Dry Forest or Keohole Center for Sustainability, get a hold of somebody who does something that intrigues you, that you're passionate about, and just give them time. It means the world to all of us. So that being said, I hope you're taking time now at home with your families, with your fur babies, if you have those, with your real babies like Jen. Take that time, be connected, and hopefully this program brings you a little bit closer to your community through this community connection. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tara.
Thank you, Jen. It was lovely having you. And we'll see you all next week, noon on Wednesday. Aloha.